We've already seen how functions can take parameters on their command lines. Well, it's actually possible for a shell script to also take command line parameters just like any other Unix program. So the fact is that any Unix command can receive parameters via the command line. It's just a matter of whether that program actually makes use of the parameters. Now we can make use of them if we choose to via the variables $1 through $9, and we use them exactly the same way as we use them inside a function. So theoretically there's very little new for us to learn here. We just have to see a few examples of this in use. Also, it's worth mentioning that $* and $# or $pound if you like may be used exactly the same way as well as they are used with functions, just like $1 and $9. So that essentially completes the set. Anything you could do with a function you can actually do with the shell script. So let's have a look at some examples of that. Here is a very simple script called palm test, which is short for parameter test, which just goes through $1, $2 and $3 and does a little if test to see if the parameter was set, and if it was, then we echo out a little message to say what it was set to, and if it wasn't, we just say that it was not set. So let's try running this program all by itself, just without any parameters first, and we find that the 3 parameters were not set. Now I'll run it again, and this time I'll provide a parameter of AAAA for the first one and BBBB for the second one. And I find, of course, that parameters 1 and 2 were set, but number 3 was not. The interesting thing about all of this is that we're just using $1, $2 and $3. We can pass any information into the script on the command line. We can pass in a file name or a sentence. A sentence can be one parameter. Let me show you an example of that. So this, and the trick is, of course, to put it inside double quotes or single quotes if you like. This is the first parameter, and then, I don't know, anything else for the second one. Now, I've got a little error message here. I was hoping I'd get this. This is actually coming from the test program. As you can see, there's a little square bracket in there where it says too many arguments. It's very easy to fix that. The problem is that I neglected to put the double quotes around that. And I've obviously got to do the same thing here. This is just one of those cases where it's vitally important that you remember to always put your double quotes around any reference to a variable when using it with the test program. So let's try that again. Well, it'd probably help if I actually saved the file. And again. And parameter number 1 is, this is the first parameter. Notice that the quotes that are in there, the double quotes that you can see after the words parameter number 1 is, those quotes were put in manually by me. They are not the quotes from the actual command line. Those quotes are removed by the shell. I'll prove that for you if you like. I'll just remove the quotes from around the $1 here, and again, and run it again, and as you can see, you actually do not get the quotes from the command line as part of your parameter. Let's have a look at another example now of how we might access our command line parameters. Here is a simple shell script that uses a for loop to loop through each of the parameters on the command line and do a couple of actions there. And all we're really going to be doing is put out a little echo message saying parameter number 1 is, and then obviously the first parameter. The next line is just a little way that we can keep track of how many we're up to. So let's run that, and we'll try the old AAA BBB, and that works quite nicely. The reason I wrote this particular example is I wanted to show you what would happen if you ran a particular program like this and fed it a very large number of parameters. like /bin/star. There's all the files in the /bin directory. Now there's probably going to be quite a few of them. Let's see how many. Well, there were actually, the shell expanded that command line so that there were in fact 86 parameters on the command line, and we have, as you can see, listed all of them. So it is possible to have a large number of parameters on the command line, and furthermore it's actually possible to reference each one of them. There's obviously no such thing as $86, but there is a $8, and there's a $7 and a $9 and so forth. There's also a $*. But of course it's actually very easy for you just to go for and use a for loop to essentially loop through each parameter on the command line. And finally, I've created a little shell script here to illustrate that there is in fact a difference between the $1 and $2 inside a function and the $1 and $2 of the shell script themselves. So I've created a little function called do nothing, and all it does is it echoes out its parameters. And then, well, that's really all the shell script does as well. So what I'll do is I'll call this shell script and I'll pass it two command line parameters, AAAA and BBBB. And when it runs, it's going to call the do nothing function and pass it XXX and YYY. We'll have a look at what the output looks like for that. Now the function's parameters are XXX and YYY, whereas the shell script's parameters are AAA and BBB. But both echo lines are actually referring to $1 and $2. So clearly we have a different $1 inside the function and a different $1 outside the function. So it's a very good idea not to get those confused. Probably the simplest or safest thing to do is at the beginning of your program or at the beginning of your function, copy $1 and $2 and any other variables from the command line that you're using away into other variables. Give them actual names like file name equals $1 and username equals $2 and so on. That has the benefit of actually making your shell script more readable as well. Now this module is entitled Advanced Command Line Control. There are a few parts of command line control that we're going to have a look at, and the first one is referencing individual command line parameters beyond $9. Remember a couple of chapters ago I told you that that actually wasn't possible, that the only command line parameters that you could actually reference individually were $1, $2 all the way through to $9. Well, there is a special command that you can invoke called shift that actually allows you to reference those individual command line parameters beyond $9. It works like this. When you call the shift command just by itself, just the word shift on a line by itself, the following things happen. Whatever value you happen to have in $1 is lost. It's just gone. So if you actually wanted to use that variable, you would probably want to copy it into another variable before you call the shift option. In other words, you might say something like first equals $1. That stores the value of $1 away in the variable called first. Now that's not the only thing that happens. $1 then is set to the value of the second parameter. So in other words, instead of $1 pointing to the first parameter, $1 now points to the second parameter, $2 points to the third parameter, and so on down to $9, which points to the 10th parameter. So you can see they've all been shifted along by 1, which is of course why the command is called shift. Let's have a look at that in action. Here is a little script called shift test, and it has a little function inside it called print palms, which is exactly the same code as we used in one of our earlier little demonstration scripts. Now we actually call that print palms function and pass it $, which is every single parameter. So what that will mean is the parameters to print palms will be exactly the same as the parameters to the shell script itself. So theoretically that will just print out all the parameters in the normal way. Then we actually run the shift command, which should get rid of the first parameter and shift all the rest along 1, and then we'll print them all out again and see what we get. So let's try that. We'll do a %, and then it's A for the first parameter, B, C. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, so initially everything looks fine. 1, 2, and 3 are A, B, and C, and so on. And then we shift, and now parameter number 1 points to B, and parameter 2 points to C. The original parameter 1 is gone completely. So I'm sure that you can see that it follows that if you had 10 parameters, exactly 10, then doing a shift would cause the first one to disappear and the 10th one to become $9, which would then, of course, allow it to be accessed individually. It is actually even possible to specify a numerical parameter to shift, which tells shift the number of, get this, shell script parameters that you want to shift. So I know that sounds awfully confusing, but let's have a look at what that might be. Shift 4. If you don't specify a number to the word shift, then it shifts 1. But you can actually get it to shift 4 at a time if you want. So $1 will be the old $5, and $2 will be the old $6, and so on. And $9, I guess, will be the old $13, if there was one. So there's just a handy little thing to keep in mind there.